Let's get this party started. So good morning, everybody. Welcome to the conversation today, best practices to secure remote work. We're going to explore how companies can best secure the remote workers and keep their data safe. My name is Rob Schenk. I'm with Intelligent Technical Solutions, and here we specialize in helping small and medium-sized businesses thrive by managing and securing their technology. A few housekeeping notes before we get into this. The discussion is going to run roughly around 30 minutes or so. We'll stick around a little longer at the end to answer any questions. The conversation will be recorded. If you'd like to review the information later and share it with any of your team members, happy to take questions during the webinar. You're going to see a Q&A box in your Zoom link, so feel free to go ahead and click that and upload any questions that you might have. And definitely want to make this as collaborative as possible, so please feel free to chime in. We'll have some time for Q&A at the end. Alrighty. So you're going to notice a QR code in the lower right corner of your screen. That's going to lead to a special offer page for attendees of the webinar. So in case you need to leave earlier, you might want to take a quick photo of that and scan it. But for today's discussion, I'd like to introduce our special guest, introducing Thomas Dunne. He's a strategic cybersecurity advisor for Field Effect. He has over 20 years of experience in the security and intelligence community. His areas of expertise are in developing and leading operational and policy teams with a focus on cybersecurity challenges. So Thomas, welcome to today's discussion. Really happy to have you.
Thanks so much. Great to be here.
Awesome. All righty, so let's talk about the overview of today's agenda. So we're going to talk about the state of remote work in 2024 and considerations as we head into 2025. There's been a lot of changes in the workforce over the last couple of years. We're starting to see some interesting trends as time has gone on recently. We're going to identify some of the risks that companies and remote teams are facing, and talk through some of the security controls that you can go ahead and implement in your organizations to go ahead and reduce risk and exposure. We're also going to talk through some practical steps that you can take to ensure that your company is managing your remote workforces securely. And we're also going to talk through ways that we can help that discussion along the way. Alrighty, so Thomas, let's talk about the state of things. So state of remote work in 2024, I've been seeing a lot of recently in the news that some companies, especially some larger ones, are mandating return to the office. We're seeing that that's kind of like a larger trend starting to take shape a little bit. On the other side of the spectrum, I've also seen a lot of small and medium-sized businesses that are maintaining kind of hybrid or fully remote status. So I'm seeing kind of like a pretty broad mix across the landscape. Can you talk through like what the impacts here and what should companies be considering here?
Yeah, absolutely. I think you've hit the nail on the head there that, we are seeing now as we've come through the end of the pandemic that which itself, of course, involved such a really big shift to almost entirely remote work for plenty of organizations, that now it's a bit of a balance back to, where remote work often means hybrid work. Recent statistics in 2024 suggest that a little over half of the US workforce is hybrid, with about 16% of employees being fully remote. Of course, this context of work and these types of changes have introduced both benefits and opportunities for organizations, but they've come with some new risks. Though in terms of the history of work in the cyber defense domain, this kind of remote work and hybrid work can present challenges because it's changed the nature of how we understand our networks. In the past, we would think of a network as having a definitive boundary, an outer wall that was understood, where we would endeavor to make sure that outer boundary was as impenetrable as possible. The sense was that if you were on the inside, well, you were protected and you were safe from compromise or attack from threat actors. But over the years, and certainly in recent years, this type of evolution to hybrid and remote work has changed the nature of that landscape and how we understand networks. So it in effect has kind of whittled away a little bit at our traditional understanding of that outer impenetrable wall. So we're looking now at how a well-defended network and environment is going to have multiple layers of defense, not just the, one outer layer. This type of shift of thinking and understanding is supported by, other statistics in the last year that, as you see here on the slide, one that captured that almost 3/4 of IT managers, described their perception of remote work as one that introduces increased cybersecurity risks. And that, a similar percentage of IT experts also believe that remote work was an extreme risk to cybersecurity. So really, what we have is a scenario where, more employees are working in hybrid contexts or fully remote contexts than in the past. And that's changed the way that they access some of the same resources that they've used traditionally. So cloud-based access for data or corporately sensitive information, and it's shared in all kinds of ways now. So really, the message I think is that the nature of remote work currently is one that we need to be mindful of this change in environment and context and how employees are working and from where and the tools that they use.
How does it what about from like a recruiting perspective? So there's also we can talk through that a little bit too.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, as I mentioned, the benefit and opportunity for organizations is often one of where there is a recruitment advantage. Remote work and hybrid work can be really appealing for employees or potential candidates for organizations. It can be a real draw for some, increased flexibility for employees, and how to balance that, to ensure that if an organization, recognizes the benefit, how to achieve that and implement it in ways that doesn't present unintended or unnecessary risks to their data and environment.
For sure. So maybe we can talk through some real world examples where companies have had compromises through remote work examples. I can maybe I can kick this off here. I can talk about one that I'm familiar with. So we had a situation occur where a prospect came in where one of the remote workers was using a personal machine, and that personal machine was connected over a VPN connection to the office. And what had happened was the remote worker had gotten that personal machine compromised by a threat actor. And it was unmanaged, so that it wasn't running any of the security software that the company had in place. So as a result, the hacker was able to leverage that personal machine of that worker, was able to hop across that VPN connection, was able to get into some of the internal systems across that, and was able to start running some commands and spreading ransomware across the environment. So that became like an incident response situation for us. We got called in to kind of stem the bleeding here, but it really kind of speaks to some of the risks that companies take when, especially when companies have unmanaged machines that aren't running the security software that the corporate machines are running, and they're still accessing corporate data. Maybe Thomas, you can kind of talk through what other scenarios that you've seen from a kind of remote work perspective.
Yeah, absolutely. I think perhaps a good place to start there to build on that example, if we look at both in 2023 and in 2024, the digital defense reports released by Microsoft, so leveraging all of their view, into the world of organizations that they have information from, suggested that in 2023, 80 to 90% of ransomware attacks over the previous year had originated from unmanaged devices. So, and tying into your example, of course, an unmanaged device would include potentially a personal device that an employee would be using. And in 2024, in their digital defense report, that number was even higher, that it pushed over 90% of cases that attacks which had progressed to a ransomware stage, that the attacker had in those cases leveraged unmanaged devices in the network. So, that I think that speaks in a crystal clear fashion to the risk of device management needs to be done in a comprehensive way. But there also needs to be, an understanding of how employees or contractors or other personnel, who have access to a corporate system and your data, how they make that connection. and from where, using what tools, etc. A couple of recent, well, in the last few years, sort of larger examples. In 2016, a former Google employee, had downloaded thousands of company files to a personal laptop. So again, an unmanaged device, more of an insider threat situation in that context, though a former employee. But that the purpose there was to try and use that information, to leverage into new employment, basically. And in May of 2022, similarly, again, a large organization, in this case, Yahoo, had a research scientist there stole proprietary information from inside the organization after receiving a job offer from another entity. And so, which then resulted in charges from Yahoo against that former employee. But I think what, the key message there for me in all of these examples is that whether the organization is big or small, these types of risks from, in terms of device management and how that's done, are present. Risks of compromise from a threat actor, or malicious intent from insiders. Equally, the size of the organization is not the determinant factor there. That the risks can exist for both big organizations and small organizations as well.
Yep. So we've reviewed a couple of real-world examples. We've talked through the threat landscape a bit. So let's better understand what are the actual risks that companies are facing. So, Thomas, how do companies want to, how can they scope out their current level of exposure? Maybe we can start that.
Yeah, I think to start scoping that out, for me, I think of that as a means of understanding your threat surface. So when we talk about threat surface, we're really talking about the overall collection of things. So the devices that are used in the organization, your network presence, and points of visibility on the internet, things like that. These are all potential attack vectors for a threat actor that they can use to try and breach your defenses and gain access to your data and compromise your systems and your information. So understanding that threat surface, I think, is really about compiling the information that you have at your disposal to paint a current and effective picture of what you have in your possession. So to think about the types of specific examples that that would fill that picture. So things like what services or applications do you have and run that are available, internet accessible, sort of that face the world, if you will. Thinking about web applications or websites, online portals, things like email services or file sharing services, virtual private networks that employees or partners may use to remotely connect to systems. But similarly, publicly available information about your organization paints part of that picture too, in terms of threat surface. So social media profiles, about us information on your website, things like that might speak to both the people that work with you and for you, and the types of work that they do. All of those kinds of things can provide information to a threat actor that then feeds into their efforts to compromise you and your assets. So, would feed into things like phishing attacks or, social engineering efforts that, looking to abuse trust relationships and things like that. When you think about other parts of your threat surface, it's things like the workstations, desktops, laptops, servers, things like that you would have that are used by your team, database services or internal file servers. And importantly, when it comes to your employees, the accounts that they use. So the credentials that they use to access your services and applications. Those, of course, are high value elements of very high interest to threat actors. Really, I think the takeaway when it comes to thinking about your risks and understanding them in the context of what your threat surface is, it's to know that the larger your threat surface, the greater the potential for exploitation by a threat actor, and thus the higher the risk to your overall security. So understanding and managing your threat surface is a means to effectively minimize the risk that you face, and thus to minimize and shrink that threat surface.
So it sounds like maybe the take-home point here is that you can't really protect what you don't know about. So you want to have a clear understanding of what you have in order to fully protect it at the end of the day.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, thinking about assets really, having a clear picture of the assets that you have, and maintaining that over time, ensuring that periodically it's assessed for updates, and keeping track of those things, super important, definitely.
Yeah. And so having some sort of kind of audit or risk assessment process would help you kind of gain that clarity overall.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Yeah. Cool. Alrighty. So we kind of have a better understanding of the landscape. You've talked about, understanding what you have in order to protect it, to understand what your exposures are. So what are some of the ways that threat actors are how are they exploiting these gaps, and how are they getting into infrastructures? What are some of the ways that they're targeting? Maybe you can talk through that a little bit.
Yeah, some of these are probably familiar to many people, and perhaps some more than others, but these are really cracks in the threat surface. So looking at concrete examples, of vulnerabilities that then relate to security practices that would increase or decrease your exposure to threat actors. Things like, excuse me, so phishing attacks, whether they are sort of generally done to all employees in an organization, or sometimes more targeted, with approaches that are much more based in social engineering, sometimes at company executives. Those things are really, that type of approach is driving at a business email compromise. So should a threat actor be able to use a phishing attack in order to gain access to an email account? Well, that affords them, of course, potential access to all of the information that's in the email, potentially using those credentials to then access other corporate information. So part of the challenge there is it can be weak passwords in some cases, or the reuse of passwords within an environment. And we talk about best practices with clients often, of course, to employ strong password practices, the use of passphrases and password managers. And we'll talk a little bit more about this when we get to some of the technical controls. But one of the big, risks that we see is instances where multi-factor authentication is not implemented. I mentioned earlier the 2023 Microsoft Digital Defense Report. Another part of that analysis suggested that the use of MFA can reduce the likelihood of compromise when it comes to email compromise by as much as 99%. So it's an extremely effective control to reduce risk.
Yeah,
personal
quick
device.
question.
I
want to interject here for a second.
Yeah.
So like you mentioned MFA and lack of MFA. So, MFA comes in a couple of different, methods, right? So you can get a text to your phone as an example. Now, just recently, the FBI just launched a big announcement to all U.S. citizens that basically the major telcos, AT&T, Verizon, T-Mobile, I think there's 8 of them altogether that have all been effectively thoroughly compromised by Chinese or threat actors, state-sponsored threat actors. And they've been compromised. And basically, the messaging is, hey, don't trust cell phone conversations. Don't trust text messages as well. What's the impact for what you're talking about here with that, just given that thing that just happened over the past couple of days?
Yeah, I think a couple of things from that. And certainly, of course, the reporting there, on that particular incident is, seems to be ongoing. Some of even in the last couple of days, some of the media around that suggesting that it may not be known conclusively if that compromise has been completely mitigated, or if the root cause in terms of how that threat actor had gained access was determined. Of course, in public reporting, some of that information may not be stated even if it were known. But I think some of the key takeaways, of course, are to be mindful of the importance of secure communications. So using secure chat applications, if they are part of your personal or professional business practice, ones that can offer encrypted end-to-end communications are obviously more protected than those that don't. And importantly, although I think that type of compromise that's described in that instance is a little bit different than something like a phishing attack or a business email compromise. But certainly, where MFA is a strong protection against account compromise, be it email or VPNs and other sensitive corporate assets, using strong MFA factors. So whether it's an authenticator application, or a hardware security token, things like that are steps above some of the earlier MFA approaches if they were email-based or SMS text-based, for sure.
Got it. Cool. Thank you. All righty.
Yeah.
Keep going.
Sorry, go ahead, Rob. Pardon me.
Yeah, so now that we have an understand the context of how cyber risks are evolving, and maybe we can talk through some security controls and what are the steps that companies should be doing to reduce their risk. So maybe you can kind of talk through the controls that people should be thinking about.
Yeah, for sure. I think so. Here we'll get into a couple of sort of main categories of controls, if you will. For example, we'll dig into a good deal into security awareness. A big focus there, of course, is on the human element, on your people. And then on some significant areas of technical controls, so things that are technical solutions for digital or physical assets, knowing that, again, that improved implementation of technical controls are going to be a fundamental part of enhancing your resilience and reducing your threat surface. But to set the stage for that, I'm first going to touch briefly on what we describe as a principle-based approach to securing remote work. So briefly, just 5 principles that can be the basis for improving your management of remote and hybrid work and reducing that threat surface. We talked a moment ago about assets and understanding the things that you have. So that's the first one, of course, knowing what you have. As Rob mentioned, you can't protect things you aren't aware of. And it sounds simple, perhaps, but it is a challenge, and it is an ongoing need for organizations, and one that we have encountered in our own work and incident response cases, that you do run into situations where, unfortunately, if an organization is facing a compromise and trying to neutralize and mitigate it, that if there is a gap in understanding of the assets that they have, or where highly valuable information is stored and what the important assets are for the organization, it makes the response more challenging, and that it can take longer to mitigate an incident. So it's a fundamental part and principle of reducing your threat surface. The second one, 24/7 monitoring and detection. Really that's about, and we'll get into that in a little bit more detail, but about having a real-time understanding and an ongoing awareness of what's happening on your network, with solutions that will alert you to problems, and such that you are not yourself necessarily trying to monitor your network 24/7, without assistance of that kind of solution. Security awareness training, a big one for employees, increasing their understanding both of the risks, but also of their role in protecting your organization from cyber threats is a big part of reducing your threat surface. Ensuring access to tools and data is only given as needed. This is known as something called role-based access controls and zero trust. So really about, for me and my role, I don't need access to everything. So implementing controls that ensure that as I access information based on my role, that what I'm given access to are only the things that I need. And then keeping the risks of remote work and hybrid work environments top of mind. Really just again, an awareness, an aspect of awareness, not from the employee's perspective, but as an organization overall. So leadership is a big part of that, in terms of having a champion within your organization who's going to be, play a leadership role in ensuring that as an organization evolves or takes on new initiatives, new projects, new equipment, and new people, that these kinds of security considerations are always top of mind. One way that to think about this is what we call the CIA of security controls, so confidentiality, integrity, and availability. So really what these things are talking about is that in the first case, corporate data, the things that are important to you, should stay private. Those things have an intended audience and an intended purpose. So thus we need to use security controls to ensure that they are confidential. But also your corporate data needs to be stored safely to ensure that it hasn't been altered from its intended form. And thinking of that basically is that, the security controls we use are going to ensure its integrity. And lastly, that your data needs to be accessible when you need it and from where you need to access it from. And more, of course, that might be through hybrid or remote work arrangements. So a big part of that is using security controls to ensure the appropriate availability of data, as I mentioned, to the right people at the right time. So all of these wrapped up, we use security controls to increase trust. They increase reliability in terms of your day-to-day practices. And so that confidentiality, integrity, and availability are really important aspects in terms of how we implement security controls. I talked about security awareness. Really, why is security awareness training important? Well, it's important because it helps to reduce human error. We are all, as individuals, links in the security chain, and at times we can be referred to as potentially the weakest link in a security chain. So how do we help minimize that? Security awareness training is certainly a big part. It helps to socialize employees to the critical role that they play in helping to protect your organization. But importantly, the awareness training can also help to create a culture of security, something that guides employees and provides direction on what they should do in the event of an incident, how to report something, who should they talk to, how should they react. These are all really important things that awareness training will feed into.
Yeah, I think we've had a lot of success in the security training programs that we've deployed when there's executive and leadership buy-in. It really has to start at the top. We've had success where teams have deployed kind of gamification strategies. And then the other part I think that's been helpful too has been situations where in the explanation of why we're doing this particular training, connecting the business training with the home network of the employee, of the team member, getting them to understand that the principles that they're learning through these programs are going to apply not only at the business and the office, but also at their personal machines, their personal networks, their friends and family. And it's going to help them, prevent issues about getting their identities stolen and things like that.
Mm-hmm.
And then once that connection is made, we see a lot more engagement and buy-in once the light bulb goes off.
I think that's really important and very true. I think, of course, with hybrid and remote work, there's a degree of work often from home environments as well. So where networks can be shared with family members who are not part of the organization, or in some cases that devices themselves might be shared. In particular, if employees use personal devices to connect to corporate networks. So increasing awareness around the risks when that type of context is present can be really, really valuable to reduce threat surface, and understanding why certain practices might be unadvisable and other practices would be encouraged in terms of reducing that type of risk. Other types of awareness training that speak to a lot of these types of risks that you see here, recognizing and reporting phishing. So having things like a phishing reporting service that's often embedded within an email application gives users a way to safely report email that might be suspicious to them, and would help them understand that it's important to wait before engaging with a suspicious email message until a response is received from that analysis service. Things like risks of an awareness around financial fraud. So awareness training is a great way to help combat that. It can help to reinforce good practices and ensuring that secure practices are in place. So things about the processes around receiving invoices or processing payments or changing bank account details, identity validation process outside of email, or ensuring that there are secondary validation channels for requests that come in. Unfortunately, what we see in financial fraud cases and business email compromise is that threat actors will try and insert themselves, into a conversation between two trusted parties, if they can get access to one of those parties' emails, and thus, put in a request to try and say, hey, we've updated our banking information. Please send your next payment here. Here's the updated invoice. And unfortunately, that manipulation of that trusted relationship is one that is difficult to combat. So important to make sure that employees are aware of that type of activity and that type of risk. You mentioned, Rob, also having a champion. Having a cybersecurity policy framework is a big part of that too. That's where you have secure practices and procedures in place, a policy framework can help formalize that and reinforce those practices. Provide guidance, reference material for employees about roles, responsibilities, and expected behaviors. So things that are quite common, password policies, setting guidance on how to create strong passwords or where to store them. Things like acceptable use policies to understand, what is permitted or not permitted in terms of using corporate resources. And things like bring your own device policy as well would form a big part of that. Lastly, I think building off of that, I think one of the important things to note here would be the importance of incident response readiness, but in particular, having an incident response plan. A really major part of reducing your threat surface and increasing your capacity to respond effectively to an incident if one should happen. The big key parts of a plan, that it's going to provide direction and guidance to incident responders and members of the team if something happens. Many incident response plans will come with or be accompanied by what we refer to as playbooks. So these are really about specific response actions to different types of incidents. So some of the most common can of course be ransomware incidents. We mentioned business email compromise a couple of times, phishing attacks. So these playbooks will speak to, the steps of response, the phases, how to recognize that something has happened, how to report that something has happened, or how to initially contain it, and then move to, advanced stages of mitigation, identifying root cause, and then implementing, additional security controls. So really thinking of a playbook as a means to implement kind of a life cycle process of responding to an incident, and then, of course, preventing that incident from happening again. So ultimately, with all of these things, awareness training, incident response readiness, and having a plan, a lot of that, would be to kind of cap it with a description of, thinking of it as being forewarned is, of course, being forearmed. So understanding your threat surface and knowing what you have and what's happening in your environment, these are critical elements to reduce your risk of compromise. So having that baseline of understanding, is going to allow you to effectively identify what's happened if something, in the event of an incident, and then what to do about it. So yeah, for our view, we highly encourage organizations and to develop a plan if they don't already have one in place.
Cool. So we've talked about human elements, security awareness considerations. So I can talk a lot about some of the technical controls. I know we're going to be running a little bit long here, so I want to be kind of brief with some of these. Maybe you can talk through some of those, Thomas.
Yeah, absolutely. Like the first one, I think I'd touch on would be real-time security monitoring. The importance there. And we'll move on then to some discussion of account protection and email protections as well. But really, real-time security monitoring, so managed detection and response. This is really about telling me what's happening on my network, and then telling me what I should do about those things. So an effective real-time solution is also going to provide some direction and guidance on, here's what has happened, here's why this is important, and here's what you should do about it. And then often, of course, accompanied with some, if you need additional help, here's where to go. So this is about taking defensive actions and preemptive actions in the event of suspicious activity. When it comes to account protection and email protection, very much, of course, account protection is about strong passwords, so strong password creation. Our recommendation is always to use a password manager for creating and storing passwords. That also helps to prevent password reuse. And in many cases, we'll also have options to alert you in the event of credentials or passwords being observed in other data breaches. So often that also is an effective utility to be able to provide you an alert or a prompt that a password should be changed. Multi-factor authentication, we've touched on that. Very much, again, reduces your chance of compromise by as much as 99%. One of the best things that you can do to reduce threat surface, bar none. It can, in some instances, be a question of culture change, but it is one that it can be done, should be done, and is very much an effective tool to reduce your threat surface. Conditional access policies, things like our email security solutions that can reinforce, that principle of least privilege and role-based access controls. So ensuring that the right people are accessing the right things from the right places and at the right times. A couple other areas I think we could touch on briefly: secure remote connectivity and user access controls. So things in these spaces, very much about things like secure VPN use, firewalls. So of course, it's not just email that needs to be protected, but also, the other important things that people access in hybrid and remote work environments. So in many cases, employing a secure VPN or virtual private network solution is also a benefit. Really, this is about controlling the access points to your environment. And then, of course, monitoring them to know who's coming in, when are they coming in, and from where to access what assets. In terms of user access controls, I think we've hit on several of these already, but really very much, about implementing the principle of least privilege, zero trust, role-based access controls. These are the kinds of things that, again, are going to ensure that users only have access to the information they need to complete the duties and things that they are responsible for. In terms of minimizing personal device use, this is something, we started off talking about some examples that spoke to the risks of unmanaged devices. Personal device use is often an area where that this is where that falls. So bring your own device policies, or BYOD, captures this type of use. The challenge here, of course, is that where personal device use is prevalent, that can also come with an inability or lack of monitoring around personal device use or enforcing security practices on personal devices. So, and including, as we talked about, the use often of a personal device from a home environment where the device may be shared with other individuals. So hard to always know exactly, by whom or for what that device might be being used. So having a BYOD policy can provide direction and guidance on that use, on minimum security requirements for connecting that device to a corporate network, or for things like installing a corporate mobile device monitoring solution. So things like that, of having sort of setting a minimum standard for security compliance and procedures where personal device use would be allowed. Importantly, mitigating these types of risks, though, monitoring, logging connections, ensuring MFA is required, again, for all of your corporate resources, and providing guidance through a policy framework. All of these things collectively will, bring down the risk, reduce threat surface. But ultimately, I think that the takeaway here would be, if you don't need to allow personal device use, it's certainly a question to ask, can it be controlled from the outset? And simply, we don't allow it unless there were a required exception for some reason that we would, document, track, approve, etc.
Yeah. Cool. So really important information that you've been sharing there, Thomas. Thank you for that. So let's kind of whittle it down to what are the key takeaways that people need to take back to their businesses.
Yeah, ultimately, I think, the remote and hybrid work environment it brings new opportunity, cost efficiency, flexibility, appeal in terms of recruitment. There's a lot of benefits to consider of these types of arrangements, but we must be mindful of the security risks that can come with, and in doing so, keeping that top of mind, thinking about that principle-based approach, gives us a way forward, if you will, in terms of implementing best practice and security controls for doing, everything we can to secure that type of remote work and connectivity in hybrid and remote work environments.
Cool. Alrighty, so ITS can help. Our job isn't here to help companies along this path. So right now, there's one simple step that you can take to help protect your organizations and your remote workers, and that's basically to schedule a risk assessment with us. For folks that are attending the webinar, we're going to extend a complimentary $5,000 value risk assessment process that will give you a very clear understanding of what your current level of risk is and exposure. So if you want to go ahead and sign up, there's a link there you can go ahead and click on. You can email us at secure@itsasap.com. and be happy to schedule this complimentary offer for you so you can have a very clear understanding of what your current exposure levels are, and you can figure out what appropriate next steps are from that point forward. So with that, let's transition over to questions. I think there's a couple questions have come in here. So Thomas, first one, if I'm not going to, let's see, hang on. If I'm not going to stop my employees from using personal devices, how do I still manage the risk that comes along with that? And where's the line between free access with device versus monitoring? You want to take that one?
Yeah, I think that the starting point for me would be the 24/7 monitoring. So having a monitoring solution in place, and an understanding of the assets that an employee would be connecting to from that personal device, so that you would have a real-time, ongoing understanding of connectivity, at all times, and to the assets that are most important to you. Building out from that, I think the policy framework and the awareness aspects of things. So exploring the extent to which minimum requirements or standards could be put in place about device compliance. So which would really mean, if an individual were allowed to connect a personal device, that's a device management solution would be able to determine, yes, that device is compliant for things like security updates, patches, et cetera, those types of things. So, practical steps that you could take to then reduce the risk of a truly unmanaged device connecting to your network.
Yeah. So here's a good one. What legal liabilities do I face if a remote worker's actions leads to a data breach?
So I think it's a good question. I think in part, it may depend where you operate. So in different jurisdictions, different obligations may be, you may face different obligations, for example, reporting when it comes to a data breach. In some contexts, in some places, for example, privacy commissioners or other types of government entities and bodies would sort of manage those obligations and reporting requirements. But sometimes they may come also with, the expectation and requirement that a sufficient security program exists, to prevent the data breach. So should would there be a complication or a legal implication in the event of a data breach? Well, it may depend. If an organization did not have a security program, which would mean, you didn't have a monitoring solution, you didn't have any cybersecurity policies, you didn't know or track the fact that you collected and held, personally identifiable information. So things like that, I think would introduce more significant risks, of penalties or other legal implications in the event of a data breach. In many circumstances, organizations who do have an effective security program in place may be unlikely to face significant sanction, if you will, in the event of a data breach, because they have taken, every reasonable step that they could to prevent it from happening. I think there's a reasonable understanding that this is a challenging environment. Data breaches do happen. But the important thing is that we understand the risk. We have an understanding of our threat surface, and we're implementing controls and procedures and practices to try and minimize that as much as possible.
Yeah, thanks for that. What's the most efficient way to secure my remote workforce without cutting corners?
I think the easiest or perhaps most effective answer to that would be, monitor first, and then build from there. So, an effective monitoring solution, that has comprehensive coverage of your environment. So that would mean, deployed to the devices that the organization uses, so desktops, laptops, servers, etc. But also taking into account whether cloud applications and services are used. So things like, if it's Microsoft 365 or Google Workspace or other things like that a monitoring solution is in place to alert you and provide you some, not only the preventive aspect of control and defense, but alert to take, other steps in reaction if you needed to in the event of something happening.
Mm-hmm. Cool. Got looks like two other questions have come in. So one, is there any specific compliance requirements for securing remote workers in industries like healthcare or finance?
So yes, I think in some places there are compliance requirements. It may depend on an industry vertical that an organization was in. So in healthcare and finance, certainly I think depending on the type of data that an organization would collect or hold, would be sort of the first starting point to know if there are compliance requirements on how to protect the data, how long you might have to store that data, or other means of security controls and requirements related to it. But I think certainly, and yeah, for healthcare data and financial data, I would expect there to be compliance requirements.
Yep. All right, last question here. I think I might be able to take this one. For an accounting firm, do you offer a review that hones in on control practices and policies for financial matters? So as part of our risk and compliance and governance services, we would be able to assist with that kind of request. So if you wanted to just reach out to us afterwards, happy to follow up and have a conversation to help out in that regard. But that's something that we can definitely help with. Okay. I can see if I have anything else comes in. We'll give another minute or so. Alrighty. So I guess with that, we'll start wrapping up. Thomas, I wanted to just really appreciate your time. Thank you for sharing really actionable and important information that we all should be taking into account as we better secure our remote workers as we head into 2025. These cyber issues aren't going away, so we want to make sure that we're protecting adequately and appropriately and comprehensively in order to make sure
Thanks
that
for
we
having
avoid.
me.
Yeah, thank you so much and appreciate it. And everybody have a great rest of your day, and we'll talk to you soon.